Okay.
Okay, you recording?
Yes.
Okay. Good day, everyone. The Jewish attitude, the Torah attitude towards wealth is that it is both a positive and negative thing, depending on how the person who has the wealth or wants to acquire the wealth deals with the situation. So we have in the Torah, in the Gemara, for instance, that Rabbeinu HaKadosh, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who was the editor of the Mishnah and one of the pillars of the Jewish world throughout eternity, was a very wealthy man. The Gemara says, Torah Gedula b'mokom echad. Great knowledge of Torah and great wealth and possessions existed in one place, in one person, in Rebbe. And the Talmud even tells us that Rebbe was equal to the Roman emperor in the foods that he had available for himself. So that even in a time when there was no refrigeration, etc., he had fresh food every day, fresh vegetables every day. So that's a very positive view of wealth. And the Gemara says that Rebbe Mechabed Ashirim, Rebbe gave great honor to wealthy people because he felt that the Lord endowed them with that gift. And therefore, they were worthy of honor and respect. Hello? You'll have to call me back. I'm on Zoom now, okay? Sorry. My granddaughter, great-granddaughter got named today. Okay. So Rebbe respected wealthy people because he felt that wealthy people had opportunities to do great things, to accomplish great things. So that's one side of the coin. That's the positive side of the coin. And we find that in all of our prayers and in our mindset, we do not want to be poverty-stricken. We don't want to be poor. We want that the Lord should grant us prosperity. And then there's the other hand. There always is this balance in life, certainly in Jewish life. The Pasuk in Kehelis, Shlomo HaMelech, who was a man of great wealth, he was the king, he possessed everything that he wanted to have. So he said, V'ra'isi dover roa tachas hashemesh. I saw in this world under the sun that there is a negative thing, a dover roa, something that's bad. Osher shomu roa labalav, that wealth brings bad events to those who have it. So on one hand, we have this enormously positive view of wealth, of Torah Gedula B'mokom Echad, of Rebbe Mechabed Ashirim, and on the other hand, we have Osher Shomer Roa Labalav. So the Torah poses this to us as one of the issues It's almost a conundrum in life. Now, I think the problem can be illustrated in the famous story of the Chafetz Chaim, who met a Jew on the street that he knew, and he asked him, how are things? And the man answered him, he said, Rebbe, it wouldn't hurt if I had another 100,000 zlotys, whatever. And the Chafetz Chaim said, how do you know it wouldn't hurt you? Because the Chafetz Chaim realized that there are people who, when they make a certain amount of money, are decent, good people. And that when they are blessed with sudden wealth, they become someone else. We see that with lottery winners. There's a great study about the fact that most people who win a lot of money in the lottery then have terrible lives because they simply can't handle it. And it's true with athletes who make enormous amounts of money for the few years that they are able to perform, and then the rest of their life is dissolute and many times even poverty-stricken. So this issue is reflected in the parshas of the Torah, especially here in the Chumash Bamidbar. There's a pattern here. Let's start first with Korah. In Yiddish, there was a folk saying, Reich wie Korah. He's as wealthy as Korah. It's based on a Gemara that Korah discovered the keys to the wealth that Yosef had stored in Egypt. Yosef had collected all the money in the world, all the wealth in the world, and it was stored somewhere. And that Korah somehow found the key, and he was able to take it. So Korah is a very, very wealthy man. But Korah becomes the epitome, the example of Osher Shomur Ra Lebolov, that the wealth turned out to be a curse for him because he says, if I'm Bill Gates, then why am I not entitled to be the head of everything? Why am I not entitled to have my opinion followed? Why shouldn't I be the ruler? Why should Moshe be the ruler? And that was a fatal mistake. It says by Korah that when the earth opened and swallowed them all, so it says, V'sayikum asher b'ragleihem. Strange phrase in the Torah, yikum. So Rashi immediately comments, Zeh hamomon, that was their wealth, shemamid odom araglov, that makes a person stand erect, that gives him status and stature, that makes him think he's a great person. And that was Korach's undoing. If Korach would not have had that great wealth, he perhaps never would have challenged Moshe, and we would not have had the whole incident, and he would have saved himself a lot of grief. But that's the example of Osher Shomer Ra Lebolov, because of the fact that the wealth destroyed him. Now we have in the Chumash, in the other Parsha, we have Balaam. Balaam, the famous Gemara that we all know, Lo Kumbi Yisrael Kemoshe Od. The Jewish people didn't have a Novi like Moshe again, but Umos Olam Kom, but the nations of the world did have a person with that potential. And who was that? That was Balaam. But Balaam is driven by his greed. Balak has to pay for me, to fill the house with gold and silver. The Balaam is a gun for hire. Money is the main thing. So even though it's obvious that God does not want him to go, tells him, so to speak, I will not allow you to curse the Jewish people. So your mission is futile. He goes anyway, because his avarice, his greed, his drive for wealth is such that even a talking donkey doesn't stop him. So we had two examples of wealth in this Chumash, Korah and Balaam, both of whom came to disaster because of it. Now, in this week's Parsha, the Torah tells us, Umikne ra voyo livnei God, livnei Reuven, livnei God, that the tribes of Reuven and Gad had enormous amounts of cattle. Now, in the ancient world, cattle was wealth. They have all of this cattle. And the cattle is what they were able to take from the war against Sichon and against Og, and other sources of wealth that they had. They have this enormous amount of wealth. And they also miss the point. They also don't get it. So they come to Moshe and they say, you know, we've got all this cattle, and that's the most important thing in our life, our wealth. So we don't want to go to Eretz Yisrael because here in Transjordan, we have pasture land for our cattle. We can become wealthier than we are. In Eretz Yisrael, that may not be the case. So, al tavirenu as hayarden. Don't take us across. We're not ready to go across the River Jordan. Moshe is shocked by the statement. It's abhorrent to him. Moshe, who spends his last year praying to God to be allowed to just go into the land of Israel, and whose blessing was that he was able to see it at least from the top of the mountain. He can't understand how a person, tribe, two tribes, say, we don't want Eretz Yisrael because our wealth, our investments will do better here in Avar Yarden than they will do in Eretz Yisrael. He can't fathom that. And therefore he answers them harshly. Why should you influence the heart of this people? You replaced your forefathers. You're a bad influence on society. You're destructive of the Jewish people. But again, we find that money is a tremendous attraction, and that it overcomes many, many times logic, even faith and belief. Chazal say, Odom bohul al mamono. when it comes to one's wealth, person is out of control. Absolutely out of control. I remember my early days as a lawyer in Chicago. So there was a client that was involved in purchasing a certain business. And I represented this client, but the client, as often is the case, is much more proactive. He thinks the lawyer doesn't do enough for him, so he's going to take the matter into his own hands. Now, he was a very observant Jew. In fact, he was a Talmud Chacham. And on Friday afternoon, the deal started to fall apart. Naturally, I couldn't do anything about it. But on Monday morning, I called up the other attorney. I'm sorry. I called up the other attorney and I said, let's have a meeting and see if we can straighten this out. Hello? I'm on a Zoom now. So he said, okay. So I went to his office and he said to me, he said, I thought that he was a secular Jew. He said, I thought that Orthodox Jews don't use the phone on Shabbat. I said, no, we don't. He said, how come I got a call from your client on Saturday? I said, what am I supposed to say? Except that the deal meant so much to him. Adam bohu al mamono, that when it comes to one's wealth, so one does things that under ordinary circumstances one would never do. And I never mentioned it to my client because I wanted to get the fee. And eventually he put the deal together, but I never saw the person in the same light again. So the Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven, Moshe will never see them in the same light again. And therefore, when the compromise is reached, and they say to Moshe, well, we'll go as the advance guard, the shock troops, we'll go in the front, and we'll stay the whole 14 years until the Jewish people conquer and divide the land. Then we'll go home. So they said to Moshe, Gidro son nivne litzonenu, we will build sheep cotes, corrals, barns to hold our cattle, ve'orim l'tapenu, and cities for our children. Moshe, when he answered them, reversed it. He said, you've got it wrong. First, you have to build Orim. First, you have to build cities for your children and your wives, for your families. And then you'll build for the sheep. That's a nuance. But they didn't understand the nuance either. So to them, their search for wealth also is Osher Shamur Ra Lebalav. Also is negative and destructive. That's not the way you're supposed to view Eretz Yisrael. It's not the way you're supposed to view the Jewish people. And I often feel that's pretty much can't speak for God, but I often feel that is the intent here, is that Eretz Yisrael is a value unto itself. Now, if Eretz Yisrael had the finest climate in the world, and it had all of the natural resources, and it was as wealthy, like Kuwait or Bahrain, wherever nobody has to work, the government gives you $1 million a year to every citizen, so then no one would appreciate Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael is made to be a challenge, a hard place, requiring adjustment, both physically and mentally, and spiritually as well. Because then it has a value. Otherwise, the value is not measured by outside wealth. The value is in itself. Now, the whole economic world is based on relative values of currencies. So today, for instance, the American dollar is the reserve currency in the world. There was a time when it was the British pound sterling. But that's a relative value. So all other currencies are measured relative to the dollar. So here we have the Shar HaYatzig, 3.5, 3.4, whatever it is. But there's a value beyond the Shar HaYatzig, and the value itself. And that is not measured in wealth. So that was the attitude that Moshe wanted to imply and imprint upon them. Moshe wanted them to understand that wealth is important and we cannot be poor, and we have to struggle not to be poor, but that is not the reserve currency. That's not the end all of life. Because if it is, well, look how people sacrifice for their jobs and for never home with their children. In the United States, where people are workaholics, or they have to be. So they're gone from 6 a.m. to midnight. There's a period of time when you never got to see your children. You got up early to go to the minyan, then you went to work. You came home late. They were in bed already, and all week long you never saw your children. So there's a price to be paid for that. There always is a price to be paid for that. I remember that when my son was a little boy, I think he was 6 years old when we moved to Miami. Maybe he was 7. So one of the leading members of my congregation in Miami said to him, "Chaim, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And he said, "I want to be a rabbi." So he said to him, "Why?" So he said, "Because he never has to go to work." And there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, I was able to eat lunch with my wife for 40 years. You're busy, you're doing, etc., but somehow you're able to have a life. So this concept, which the Torah repeats over and over again here, is meant to impress upon us a relative system of values. The values of family first, Orim nivne letapenu, family. And then the idea of Eretz Israel, that's primary. Then we can discuss the other things. But if there is no sense of values, if we're like Balaam or we're like Korah, if the only value that we see is physical wealth, so that is what Shlomo HaMelech warned us about, Osher Shomuro Labalav. Now we have one more point that I want to mention here. The Torah tells us that Chatzi Shevet Menashe, half of the tribe of Menashe, also went with the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven in Transjordan. The Torah does not indicate why they did that. And nowhere does it say that they had a lot of cattle. And why should half the tribe be split? So the Netziv of Volozhin, Reb Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, in his famous parish, the Hamik Dover, says here a great idea. He says that it was Moshe's idea to send half the tribe because Menashe was descended from Yosef. And Yosef loved Eretz Israel. And Yosef told his family to take his bones and bring them back to Eretz Israel. He doesn't want to stay in Egypt. And the children of Yosef were Mechaviv Esoretz. We saw that with the daughters of Slavchad. That's the tribe of Menashe. They said, Loma Nigora, how could it be that we shouldn't have a share in Eretz Israel? So Moshe wanted to give a good influence to the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. An influence that would teach them the value of Eretz Israel. An influence that would not be dependent upon their own wealth, because they didn't come with cattle. So therefore he sent half the Shevet Menashe with the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, hoping that it would temper their attitude and make them more aware of what the true value of what he wanted to accomplish was and should be. So that's why half the Shevet of Menashe went. The Gemara teaches us that it really didn't help. The Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, the Transjordan people, went into exile far earlier than any of the other Jews in the land of Israel, even before the kingdom of Israel went into exile with Sancheriv. They couldn't hold their own because wealth is transitory. It's not permanent. And because of that, therefore, the lack of a permanent value system destroyed them. And Chazal always wonder whether even at the end of days they will come back, will be part of the Jewish people. There are different opinions. So we see here a pattern of what the Torah wants to teach us on a very delicate subject, so to speak. One that there's a lot of gray area. It's not black and white. Everyone has to decide for themselves within their own challenges what the value system is and how it should be pursued and what should be accomplished. And to a great extent, that is, even in our time, the measure of a person. because we have lived in a time when the Jewish people have acquired wealth as they never have had before, probably since the time of Yam Suf and Mitzrayim. The Jewish people always were poor in the exile, poverty. And poverty was our enemy, and it helped destroy Jews. But wealth also destroys. So one has to know how to deal with it. Not to deal with it rationally, and not to, so to speak, be possessed by it. So I think that this is an important lesson from this week's Parshas. We conclude the Chumash Bamidbar this week. Chazak, chazak, v'nis chazek. We should all be strong and well, and somehow this scourge will pass from us, and we'll be able to learn together in shul, face to face, unmasked. Be well, everyone. Shabbat shalom, and thank you for listening.